Hello. How are we doing for sound check? Can you hear me? Yeah? Hi, I'm Abigail Backen, and it is my immense pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Yasmin Abulaban, on the occasion of her delivery of the annual Canadian Political Science Association presidential address. So I'll just say a few words, and then we'll be able to hear from Yasmin. So Yasmin is an extraordinarily accomplished political scientist. She's an award-winning mentor and scholar, having earned prestigious McCullough Awards at the University of Alberta in the areas of both teaching and research. She's an outstanding and prolific researcher and writer, and I have been privileged to be able to work with her as a collaborator over recent years, and our work is continuing. She's also an incredibly warm and caring friend, a very dedicated parent and daughter, and has a very wry sense of humor that will buckle you over when you least expect it. So in a few minutes I have here, what I thought I would focus on is Yasmin's exceptional scholarship. Her productivity is matched only by her originality. She brings consistently unique and creative approaches to the study of politics. Her many books include deep analyses of immigration, multiculturalism, and employment equity in multiple dimensions. It includes situating North America in a redefined continental relationship. It includes a path-breaking reframing of power and patriarchy, and a close focus on how surveillance interfaces with population, territory, and power. Her numerous articles and chapters build on these and other themes, all engaged in some of the most complex and challenging issues of politics today. So when I was thinking about this introduction, I was thinking, what is the arc that is remarkably refreshing about Yasmin's approach to politics? What is it that animates her work? And I think it can be summarized as a passionate commitment to both understanding states of difference and differences among states. In terms of states of difference, Yasmin displays a willingness to study power not only from the point of view of those who are represented, but from the point of view of the under or unrepresented, to consider the meaning of politics from the perspective of a wide understanding of human rights that cannot pick and choose who we get to think of as human. Yasmin's understanding of states of difference among citizens and also non-citizens allows us to understand much more complex processes from a perspective where gender, race, class, statelessness, and marginalization are seen as central to the understanding of how states work and how they sometimes don't work or fail. In terms of differences among states, Yasmin is both a quintessential Canadian political scientist and a Canadianist, as well as a committed comparativist. She looks through a wide lens that places Canada in the context of not only place, but also of time, in a global and historical variation. Yasmin's unquenchable commitment to understanding states of difference and differences among states has led her to courageously focus on some of the most challenging issues in politics today. Indeed, this deep commitment has defined our ongoing collaboration, focusing on issues of race and power in the complex web of Israel-Palestine. While Yasmin, like me, rejects a narrow essentialism, in our work we have methodologically embraced identity in a certain way. Yasmin's rootedness in the Palestinian diaspora has served to enrich my own identity as part of the Jewish diaspora. This aspect of our collaboration is something Yasmin has boldly highlighted, helping me, and I think many others, to have a sense of remarkable optimism, even in the face of apparently intractable global conflict in the Middle East. She diligently generates understanding of circumstances that are related to moments of violence and trauma that sometimes seem to be absolutely unspeakable. To address such challenging issues, Yasmin is profoundly committed to ethical engagement in politics as a lived reality, with all the complexities that entails. She embraces, eyes wide open, conflict, contradiction, and mediating institutions in which we work, live, and love. One example, Yasmin, with a small but mighty group of political scientists, of which I was privileged to be a part, established the Race, Ethnicity, Indigenous People in Politics, Race, Ethnicité, Peuple, Langue et Politique section of the CPSA in 2009, a section that has become a core element of our association. Yasmin is also highly and ethically dedicated to the universities in which we work and teach, to the families, her own and others, as sites of deep meaning and responsibility, and to friendship with all that entails. In all this, Yasmin always reminds us and reminds me that we have to both work hard and play hard. The Canadian Political Science Association has and will continue to benefit immensely from Yasmin's creativity and leadership. And now, sit back in this movie theater style auditorium because we are about to be able to have a tremendous treat. Yasmin is going to give us a unique talk about our own discipline titled Narrating Canadian Political Science Towards a Revisionist History. Please join me in welcoming the President of the Canadian Political Science Association, Dr. Yasmin Abulaban.
Abby, thank you very much for the introduction. I would like to begin by acknowledging that Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Dans une association bilingue canadienne, la question du choix de la langue parlée est complexe, comme l'a souligné Alain Noël en 2014. Je vais surtout parler en anglais parce que c'est dans cette langue que je me sens le plus à l'aise. Même si je parle en anglais, j'espère l'esprit de mes propos sera rejoindre les francophones du Québec et d'ailleurs. So the 150 mark of Confederation and the founding of the modern Canadian state is coming at a time when at universities across Canada, it is now routine to acknowledge traditional territory, as I just did, and in so doing, to recognize its longer history dating before 1867 and before the establishment of European colonies. Doing so gives recognition to the Indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live on the land, as well as the ways in which land figures into Indigenous identities and ontologies in ways that are typically very different from those of settlers. This kind of acknowledgement is also happening at cultural events, and it's even happening at hockey games with the fall 2016 Heritage Classic game on the home turf of the Winnipeg Jets, believed to be the first. So as a consequence, we are living in a moment in which we are being reminded about buried and unacknowledged history, as well as the colonial past and the colonial present. The Canadian government is spending $500 million to celebrate Confederation, but clashing historical narratives have also given rise to the question of whether Confederation is something to actually celebrate. And so here you can consider the striking title of the new book by Carol Ladner and Myra Tate, Surviving Canada, Indigenous Peoples Celebrate 150 Years of Betrayal. Well, in my address today, I want to turn the issue of narrative inward. And so what I wanted to do is address the history of Canadian political science and how it might be narrated in light of the discipline's organizational and ideational foundations and complexity. Graham White is no doubt correct in saying that no single account of Canadian political science can please everyone. And so knowing I'm going to disappoint, my goals are very modest. So the first goal is to present one rendition or narrative of Canadian political science in hopes of kickstarting more discussion and debate about our Canadian discipline as part of the American and international development of political science. And the second goal is to invite more mindful consideration of what the present offers and, by extension, the future. So I'm going to begin here. And I start with a very interesting fact, and that is that the Canadian Political Science Association is the second oldest political science association in the world. It was founded in 1912, just after the American Political Science Association founded in 1903. There was an inherently national logic to the CPSA. In 1913, the first president, Adam Short, said its aim was a thorough first-hand study of our own conditions and institutions and acquiring a larger perspective of ourselves and our affairs. Given this national focus permeating the founding vision of the CPSA, it strikes me as odd that it is a foreign narrative that gets a lot of airtime in many disciplinary overviews. And so to put my concern in the starkest of terms, I would say many of us have absorbed and taught our students what can be called the dominant narrative of Canadian political science and political science. And this is based on a clearly American-centered, Kuhnian-inspired revolutionary history involving behavioralism as a paradigm, with the actual phrase, the behavioral revolution, coming into wide circulation since 1968. So omnipresent is the narrative around the behavioral revolution that I would go as far as to say that it not only references a method or a stance around the possibility of a science of politics, but a way we tell time in political science. And this, of course, was helped when David Easton so memorably signaled the so-called post-behavioral turn in 1969. So we all know there are efforts to Canadianize this narrative. This is done when we stress that David Easton was Canadian. It's also done when we claim that somehow Canada was protected from the excesses of behavioralism by a made-in-Canada political economy approach, or European training, or the French language. But whenever there is an effort to Canadianize the story, it still references behavioralism, and therefore it actually reinforces the dominant narrative. Now, the case for decentering the behavioral narrative is not to ignore the impact of important contributory work on political behavior since the 1960s, or work that uses quantitative approaches. But the reality is that the flagship journal for the CPSA features both quantitative and qualitative articles. And moreover, the very split between quantitative and qualitative approaches may be exaggerated, because I think a lot of political scientists would agree that there is often benefit to mixed methods, approaches, and triangulation. So then why does this dominant revolutionary narrative about behavioralism linger? So I think perhaps one reason is, just like the American Revolution, the dominant revolutionary narrative in political science is exciting. In American political science, it's even sometimes punctuated by so-called disciplinary rebellions. And this was evidenced, for example, in the Perestroika movement of the early 2000s. Canada had no revolution with Confederation. In fact, the preamble of the British North America Act said union was to promote the interests of the British Empire. So no wonder that back in the metropole, British parliamentarians were said to be bored and silent during the Canada debate, which brought the BNA Act to fruition, along with semi-independence. What was far more compelling to these parliamentarians was the next item on the order paper the day of the Canada debate. And that next item, by the way, was a dog tax, which did generate lots of debate because poodles and greyhounds were going to be charged less than other breeds. So all this might start to kind of recall Seymour Martin Lipset and his famous distinction contrasting America's more revolutionary political culture in contrast to Canada's evolutionary one. However, when it comes to political science, even some American political scientists are now starting to question why American political science is so invested in the revolutionary behavioral narrative. And when it comes to Canada, it is my contention that the dominant revolutionary narrative is ill-suited for understanding many of the developments, the striking features, and innovative advances we might find when we start to actually examine the evolving organizational and ideational features of Canadian political science. And so in what follows, I want to offer the outlines of a different narrative about Canada that's less about revolution than evolution. This is not an evolutionary account that argues that dominant ideas and advances shift mainly because of generational or cohort differences. Rather, my reading is attuned to structural power as well as individual agency and choice. And so I argue that the organizational and ideational evolution of political science is closely interconnected with Canada's history and unequal social relations since Confederation. And this is because organized political science in Canada was really at heart a national venture. As a consequence, to understand the ideas animating early political scientists, we have to consider Canada's foundational status as a settler colony in the North American space with a privileged place in the British Empire. This perspective may also help to highlight the distinct features of the colonial present, which I would suggest are giving rise to multiple sites of knowledge production or multiple knowledges. And so to illustrate this argument, I will take a threefold approach, which very roughly corresponds with 50-year blocks relating to the semi-centennial, centennial, and sesquicentennial of Confederation. So first, drawing from the post-colonial perspective associated with Edward Said, I will consider the semi-centennial foundation of modern political science as a national project in which knowledge and power were closely interconnected with settler colonialism. Second, I'll review the centennial transition of Canadian political science beginning in the late 50s and 60s as one expressing decolonizing impulses as well as giving voice to less powerful groups. And then finally, I want to conclude by addressing our sesquicentennial moment and better potentiating the reality of multiple knowledges. I believe we are on the threshold of a really exciting new era which carries all kinds of possibilities, especially if we are collectively more mindful about our past and about our real choices for the future. So let me turn to the issue of power and knowledge at the semi-centennial. So the late Palestinian-American literary critic Edward Said is associated with what is now being called the Arab American left. Said, in particular, came to give voice in English to the experience and perspectives of the Palestinians as a dispossessed people, and also with the publication of the now classic book Orientalism in 1978, he built upon Michel Foucault's understanding that there was an interrelationship between knowledge and power. Said specifically considered how the so-called Orient was studied and understood in the academy and in corridors of power. And so for Said, Orientalism is a manner of thinking and a style of scholarship based on an ontological and epistemological distinction between the East or the Orient and the West or the Occident. So this form of knowledge provided a justification for power in the form of colonialism and the continued domination by the West. So in other words, it was a form of knowledge that was really about power over the other. Now, although there may be many points of origin for post-colonial thought, both geographically and intellectually, Orientalism is credited with ushering in a new field of studies around colonial discourse and post-colonial theory. Said's work has been widely taken up globally across disciplines. However, it is the way that it's been taken up by Canadian political scientists that provide a vista on something very interesting. And then here's why. Not only has Said's work been used by Canadian political scientists like Mojtaba Mahdavi and Andy Knight to counter Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis about the Middle East, but it has also been used by Canadian political scientists concerned with a wide variety of other topics and jurisdictions. For example, Said's work's been utilized by Laura MacDonald to address the relationship between Canada and the developing world, by Elaine Stavro to examine how the SARS epidemic inspired a discourse in which Torontonians were contrasted positively with bad Chinese global citizens. Abigail Bakken has used Said to address racism and offer a fresh consideration of the so-called Jewish question. Linda Cardinal, Claude Couture, and Claude Denis have used Said to critique conventional understandings and historiography on Quebec's Quiet Revolution. Chantal Maillet to anchor an exploration of feminism in light of the complexity of relations of domination and the national question in Quebec. And Joyce Green has drawn on Said's work as a tradition inspiring a critical approach to indigeneity, as well as attending to the voices of Indigenous women in Canada. And I think the list could go on. I provide this list by way of highlighting the sheer variety of topics Canadian political scientists have covered using post-colonial theory. And what it signals is that there are potentially multiple others in Canada. Arguably, this in itself is rooted in Canada's formation as a settler colony. In Canada, as in other settler colonies, complex and unequal relations have and continue to play out around race, ethnicity, class, language, region, gender, and other forms of differentiation. Moreover, if we apply post-colonial theory inwards towards the organizational and ideational foundation of political science, the construction of self and multiple others stemming from Canada's foundational status as a British settler colony in the North American space becomes really evident. So the idea for the CPSA came from a group of Canadians having lunch together at meetings in Boston. The CPSA involved a lexiconal assertion of a Canadian self against an American other and non-Canadians in general. However, Adam Short, the first president and also then chair of the Canadian Civil Service, was really clear that the distance between the Canadian self and the American other was not large in comparison with others stemming from perceived civility or race. He felt CPSA should be modeled after other associations to be found amongst kin in America and Britain, which were characterized as civilized nations, and spoke of Canada's connections between these two countries as involving, quote, certain inherent qualities of race. As a national project, the establishment of CPSA could also be very easily presented as a semi-centennial Confederation project. At the time of its founding, one academic enthused that CPSA created a feeling of nationality that proved the fruits of Confederation are ripening rapidly. The goal of this project was to provide knowledge, and so as articulated by Adam Short, the CPSA was to generate solutions for our specifically Canadian problems and conditions, as well as to make Canada an original contributor to the world. It is the perceived Canadian problems and conditions in need of a solution that provide the greatest clues into who the most distant others were, and hence where knowledge turns to power. In this case, power comes in the form of assimilation or Anglo-conformity in a country presented without any reference to Indigenous people. So further suggesting the close association between CPSA and the state in its founding, Prime Minister Borden attended the first CPSA meeting, and he welcomed the new association given the great task of assimilating newcomers. Borden's comments helped to also place Adam Short's contention that the factors motivating the need for the CPSA included Canada's, quote, absorption of so many new and strange elements into its population. Now, this was, of course, a period of expansion into Western Canada, settlement expansion. It was a period of heavy immigration from the then new source countries in Eastern and Southern Europe, who differed from the preferred potential immigrants, which were white British origin Protestants. Now, echoes of the concerns identified by Short and Borden are clearly evident in the published papers delivered at CPSA right through World War II. So, for example, in a separate paper given at the first meeting of the CPSA in 1913, the author ends by proclaiming, the salvation of our national life depends upon the Canadianizing of these newcomers through their children who are Canadian-born. A 1930 paper by W. Burton Hurd makes the case for restricting so-called Oriental immigration. It opens talking about Canada's two population problems. The first is the geographic distribution of different racial groups in Canada, and the second is just the mere presence of racial and cultural diversity. Similar to how Indigenous people were made to be invisible from the land through state policies like residential schools, as Carol Ladner notes, they were practically invisible in political science itself, save for occasional interventions, such as a 1937 paper on Manitoba's so-called half-breed problem. The justifications for immigration restriction effectively continue in the 1940s with the presidential address by C.A. Dawson in 1943, who identifies a new problem. In Dawson's estimation, those of British, French, and Slavic origin can live together peaceably, but the item of central importance is high racial visibility in terms of color and feature. And he specifically said those of Chinese and Japanese origin, quote, bear a physiological badge that destines them to be, in some sense, perpetually strange and alien to the rest of us. Dawson's specific intervention also meshes with Prime Minister Mackenzie King's well-known 1947 statement arguing against immigration from the so-called Orient. So how can we understand this history of political science at the dawn of the centennial of Confederation and in the decades that followed? So here it might be worth recalling Confederation itself. And just to remind you, I share a photo. This is from the original 1884 painting of the Fathers of Confederation by Robert Harris. This painting was destroyed in fire in Parliament in 1916, but you get the picture. So the conferences in Charlottetown and Quebec City that led to Confederation were marked by the complete absence of Indigenous representatives. Female and working class representatives and perspectives were also absent from the Confederation debates. Moreover, despite what has been called the moral vision of Georges-Étienne Cartier and the tenets of a pluralist federalism, in practice there was grudging and limited attention to the rights of French speakers, especially outside Quebec. So given this history, it's not at all surprising to observe that the social relations of inequality permeating the foundation of the modern Canadian state at Confederation are also reflected in the foundation and early history of organized political science. The superb account given by Janice Newson of the formative decades of CPSA underscores that leaders and members of the CPSA were hardly representative. The organization was comprised of men who were elites, not only in academe, but to a lesser extent business and government. Discussions were in English. Members from Ontario dominated. There was limited representation from Francophone Quebec. There were few from the labor or health fields. Less than 2% of members were women. And of those women that were there, they were pretty much absent when it came to giving learned papers. So in short then, just as difference is foundational to Canada, the fixation on difference was a central plank in the ideational construction of Canadian political science, which was all about identity politics. And in fact, this was identity politics par excellence. The most distant others, especially as determined by distance from ideas of whiteness, were treated as problems. And the goal was to build knowledge in service of a nation that was being built, that is, a white settler colony whose institutions, practices, and language derived from Britain. Okay, so now we get to move from black and white to color, because we're going to enter the 1960s. It's not quite, it's not quite the psychedelic 60s, but it's color. Okay, so this is a replica painting by Rex Woods of the Fathers of Confederation, and it was commissioned by the Confederation Life Insurance Company to commemorate the 100-year centennial in 1967, and today this painting sits in Parliament. So let me turn to the evolution of the discipline at the centennial of Confederation. So given the ideational and organizational formation of Canadian political science as a national venture, the period from 1967 and the centennial of Confederation to the present is really extraordinary. The Canadian state may remain colonial, but it clearly moves from policies discursively embracing Anglo-conformity to ones expressing cultural pluralism and human rights. Political science also becomes more voluminous as well as more layered and complex. And so as a consequence, it is much more difficult to identify a clear effort to produce a single source of knowledge in service of colonial power, as we saw with the semi-centennial era. Moreover, the centennial era of political science involves expressions of and attention to what might be called decolonizing struggles. These have taken the form of interest in and sometimes strong solidarity with Francophones, assertions of Canadian independence from Britain or the United States, and more forcefully in recent years, assertions of indigeneity. Relatedly, rather than merely overlapping with the state, the work of some political scientists also came to question state power, to consider the empowerment of less powerful social groups like women, workers, and racialized minorities, and the social movements that may articulate their aspirations. And so as a consequence of all this, the way Canadian political science expresses itself ideationally and organizationally moves from being merely national to multinational, that is signaling more than one national aspiration, and it moves from being kind of univocal to multivocal. Now, not everything maps on to neat 50-year blocks from Confederation. And so in my revisionist account, the 1950s and early 1960s are important, but not because of behavioralism per se. Rather, they are important for revealing the earliest of impulses towards decolonizing and diversification in the discipline. And so to illustrate this, I want to draw on a few select presidents and their addresses. You'll notice when I do this that I don't talk about behavioralism through any of them. And in fact, in the really excellent overview and analysis given by Jack Lucas of all the CPSA addresses given by presidents, he notes that there's never been an explicit address devoted to behavioralism in the Canadian Political Science Association. And so for illustrative purposes, I'm going to just focus on three presidents and addresses that I view as harbingers of the way in which decolonizing impulses and social relations of inequality came to shape the organizational and ideational features of the discipline at the centennial. And so these are J. Douglas Gibson in 1956, Eugene Forsey in 1962, and Mabel Timlin in 1960. So I want to start with J. Douglas Gibson. So attention to Canada's place in North America was clearly signaled in the address of banker Douglas Gibson in 1956, who argued that since World War II, the US had overtaken Britain to become Canada's predominant external influence. And in his words, certainly in the economic sphere, the United States constitutes the only real threat to Canadian independence, and it will remain our chief economic preoccupation as far ahead as one can see. I think this is prophetic. I mean, just think of all the debates around free trade, around NAFTA, around softwood lumber, around investment, and all that intense scrutiny given to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau when he went to visit a newly inaugurated Donald Trump. By the way, on social media, Trudeau pushing back against that really weird handshake was proclaimed worthy of a Canadian heritage moment. It wasn't actually made a Canadian heritage moment. I just don't want to be accused of fake news. And Trudeau's handshake was also proclaimed on social media to be the greatest act of Canadian sovereignty ever exhibited. So there's lots going on around the US relationship with Canada. Over the past 50 years since the centennial, political economists and also IR specialists of Canada and Quebec have continuously struggled and debated how best to understand Canada's place in North America and in the international system. Paul Kellogg's recent work, Escape from the Staple Trap, nicely illustrates these kind of debates. And I would say they are at base reflective of the uncertainty of power and place in settler colonies. The same uncertainty of place is what I would argue was evident in the Americanization debate concerning the academy, which still sometimes has reverberations in hirings in Canada. If you follow my logic, this is not so much about methods because, after all, American political science makes use of both quantitative and qualitative approaches. And lest we could ever forget, assertions of sovereignty from Britain were also part and parcel of the very quest for patriating the Canadian Constitution, with the entire process, its aftermath, and the new charter animating much work on federalism, constitutional politics, and the Constitution since the 1960s. Peter Russell has even helpfully highlighted constitutional sovereignty as one dimension of sovereignty in Canada's constitutional odyssey, and that idea really only makes sense if there's a consideration of Canada's settler colonial foundation and the control exercised by Britain. The failure to achieve the consent of Quebec in the Patriotic Constitution and other exclusions relating to federalism in the Constitution were also addressed in the work of many, many others. And that brings me to Eugene Forsey and the multinationalization of Canadian political science. Just as a segue, before I talk about Eugene Forsey, please note that in 1952, the very first Francophone president of CPSA, Father Georges-Henri Lévesque, gave the first presidential address published in French. However, the Canadian Journal of Economics and Political Science was not really systematically bilingual. Okay, so turning to Forsey, the CPSA becoming officially bilingual is highlighted in Eugene Forsey's 1962 bilingual address at the height of the Quiet Revolution, describing Quebec as a cauldron whose lid has just blown off. Forsey also called on English speakers to learn French and for an Anglo-French partnership in the tradition of Cartier and Macdonald. The 1960s, of course, comes to be marked by the dramatic expansion of universities and the growth of PhD programs in Canada, and also sees a decision to support the formal splitting away of economists from political scientists in 1966. This is followed in 1968 by a newly named journal still in circulation, our beloved Canadian Journal of Political Science, Revue Canadienne de Sciences Politiques, which was defined from the start as bilingual. Questions relating to cultural pluralism, language politics, and linguistic minorities also stem from this period, and this also forms some linkage with all the contemporary work dealing with discussions about multiculturalism, citizenship, and multinational treaty or pluralist federalism. In any case, even as the CPSA moved to embrace bilingualism, the face of organized political science was widening with the 1963 foundation of what is now known as the Société Québécoise de Sciences Politiques. At the ideational level, it was also deepening. The 1982 rationale given by Denis Monnier for the then new journal of SQSP, La Revue Québécoise de Sciences Politiques, was the growth of interest in Quebec in many areas of political science from the 1950s, and the market for a specifically French language journal to meet the needs of Quebec-based scholars. The rationale given for the same journal's title, moving to Politique et Société in 1995, is equally notable for signaling a greater embrace of comparative and international dimensions. Yet another decolonizing impulse which proved impossible to continue to ignore relates to Indigenous people. Since the 1990s, there's been growing attention paid by political scientists to Indigenous peoples and politics. Indigenous scholars in particular have been building a body of work on Turtle Island and its northern component, now called Canada, that is also in conversation with other post-colonial thinkers and regions and alerts us to other forms of knowledge. And here I think of the critical interventions made by Taiyaki Alford, Isabel Altamirano, Glenn Coulthard, Cheryl Lightfoot, and Rona Kokanen, amongst others. These scholars often straddle political science and Indigenous governance or Native studies programs, suggesting a new kind of organizational complexity developing in the discipline. Finally, before moving from Eugene Forsey, another way he's important is that he captures an extreme, and I would say unfair, response to the more uncertain relationship between political scientists and state power than is evident in the semi-centennial period. Declassified documents obtained through access to information by the Toronto Star in 2012 show that Forsey was under surveillance by the RCMP. This surveillance was because of his perceived left-wing views